Hmm. It takes a moment when I get started for this to load up. Okay, great. Looks like I can see, yeah, I can see where people will be chatting if you interact. So, good morning. If you're here live, please let me see you. Just say hi. I love getting to interact with people and getting to discuss things, hear your points, and answer questions when you have questions. So, uh, for so I want to give a little context for those who are signing up for the first time or seeing this as one of the first things, or as a reminder for like the general context of these episodes. So this is a series I'm doing on memetic literacy. They're meant to be isolated, so this is the first one you're seeing. That's perfectly fine. So memetic literacy is this larger context of what it's about the context that we collectively, the human race, are in right now. What are the struggles that we're all facing? Why are we facing them the way that we are? But it also zooms in on the individual experiences. Why is it that when I why do certain kinds of entertainment really appeal? Like, what's up with Potter mania? Why was that a thing? Why is it that certain kinds of work resonate with people more than others? And like, memetic literacy doesn't answer all of these in all the detail, but it provides an important context for why. Particularly things like when, why is there guilt about not being productive enough, or why are there what's actually up with misogyny, or with anti-Semitism? What's all this about? Where is it coming from? Right? And that gives context for what could we possibly do about it. One of the basic orientations I give to all of this is like, what you can do about it is become aware of the context. In the same way that the chances are very good that you have no power over, for instance, what Putin is doing or not doing in the Ukraine. You have no personal power in any meaningful sense. Like, you cannot change or stop the effects of climate change or political polarization. These things are just too big. But what you can do is understand the context. So if you can come to an embodied and clear seeing understanding of context, then you can act as a node of sanity. It's not about believing the right things. It's not about asserting them. It's about just understanding. And I keep using this tagline in my Twitter feed, where there my handle is Morphenius. Like my tag everywhere is Morphenius, Morphenius. So I keep using this tagline of just notice. Because there's nothing extra you need to do. You'll have more context after you notice, after you orient. So this is a series on exploring why we are how we are, which to a large extent often involves exploring history. But not as a bunch of dry facts. That's not the idea. The idea is not, well, this happened at this time, and that's an important thing to remember. Like, I sometimes get into that because there's a lot of detail. There's a lot of story that's actually very rich and beautiful. But the purpose of it, the purpose of any of it, is that history lives in us. History is the study of context. It's just that context and time turn out to be very related. So looking at the past and understanding the context of how we got here ends up being a pretty huge factor in understanding our memetic context, our idea and belief context, our ideas of what's important, what's relevant, how do we talk, what principles do we believe in, freedom and democracy, right? Those are memes, so, or memeplexes, I should say. So this is a series on orienting to all of that. So for this week, cults. I was so tempted this morning to put on my long sleeve white hippie shirt. It's got this little V-neck, little sun symbol here. And when I do that with the long hair and the way that, like, and the beard and all of that, it just like Jesus. I just look like Jesus. All right, my children. So but that might be a bit much. So right. So uh yeah, Tin mentions, oh God, the way history was taught to me was so dry and boring. Yeah, I have so many opinions about education. At one of these weeks, I'll end up talking about why education ends up being boring, why it's kind of soul sucking. There's actually a memetic reason for it. And part of understanding memetics and memetic context is not just about knowing these facts. It's about recognizing that there are principles about how ideas and behavior move across people, across groups of people, and across generations. My PhD is in mathematics education. I have a lot to say about the education structure, but yeah, there's every subject has been gutted in the implicit name of, without people necessarily consciously intending this, in the name of numbing the mind, despite the absolute best intentions of most people who are actually involved. The system evolved in order to numb minds. So, well, that's its own thing. So, one of the reasons I want to talk about cults is that it keeps coming up in my spheres. I think a reasonable person would say that I've been involved in a few cults. Arguably, I am in one right now. It's kind of weird to say it that way, but I don't know, the person running this particular community where most of my spiritual work happens within is like Perry Chase. Even called her space the Cult of Truth, just to own it, right? And basically nobody objected, and was like, okay, it's Cult of Truth, right? Sounds great. I mean, we still listen to you, Perry. Or no, Perry's awful. Doesn't matter whether she calls it a cult or not. Okay. I see Marcel mentioning Nora Harai / Brief History of Mankind does a great job in doing it better. Cool. Thank you for the reference. So, but I've been involved in a few. Like there have been a couple of online communities I've been involved in that were about. One was dedicated to. Well, it evolved into my job. This is actually part of the origin of me running a company in California, the Center for Applied Rationality. That came out of a group that is sometimes considered to be basically an apocalypse cult, an end of the world cult focused on artificial intelligence rising up and destroying everything. And here we are trying to save the day by coming up with some alternative and fighting against the forces of ignorance. It's very involved. It's absolutely an apocalypse cult type narrative. But there's also been a lot of frustration in that group about calling us a cult dismisses the realness of what we're doing. I think you could say the same thing about, I don't know, Scientology. Well, I bet a bunch of Scientologists feel something similar too. So this orientation to, oh, how do you spell Perry Chase? Perri. I'll just reply here and write that here. So that is Perri Chase, like that. Oops, I don't want to tag her though. Okay. So, right. So it turns out that when you actually poke at this thing, like why do things get called cults, and what does it mean for something to be a cult? What is the actual problem? Not just why are we scared of them, but like what is the structure? What is the actual issue? Lots of people now know to reference Kool-Aid, but they don't even know why Kool-Aid is attached to cults. People roughly my generation and older remember because it was talked about. But this is something that happened, I think it was in the 1970s, if I remember right, the Jonestown Massacre. Okay. But a lot of people don't even know about Jim Jones and the Jonestown Massacre. They're not aware of the details. They just know, oh yeah, drink the Kool-Aid, or you like Kool-Aid, right? And they know Kool-Aid is somehow associated with cults. But the way that these little meme fragments, these little ideas about cults spread these days, I bet for most people about 20-ish and younger, have no idea why Kool-Aid has anything to do with cults. Um, this is an important loss of context. It's not that you need to know these facts, but there's something very telling about what this particular thing about cultishness, why is it that anybody has a draw towards them? Why do people join Jim Jones? Why do people join Scientology? Okay, what's the draw? Okay. When people get into these yoga communities where it's like, oh yes, we know, like I know that it sounds kind of weird, but we have a real guru. Like he's the real thing. Right? And then people want to gravitate to this, and then it turns out there are sex scandals. And why is it always sex? Like why sex scandals? So all of this is all clustered together. And when you actually look at why and you follow the threads, a really thorough telling of this goes back at least 1,500 years. This and arguably it goes back farther than that. A really good telling would go all the way back to roughly the time of the Buddha and of the golden age of Greece, and some of the pre-Socratic philosophers, going into Pythagoras and some of the mystery schools that were centered around Egypt. So this goes back really, really far. But we don't have to go back quite that deep to get what I think is a really beautiful snapshot, something very clarifying. So for today's story, what I want to focus on is mostly the unfolding that happened in the 20th century. So I'm going to give some very brief context for how the 20th century, like what was the stage, and then this story actually does arc through the whole thing with the world wars and Nazis, communism, the rise of the free love movement. All of this is all wrapped together and provides a very important context for why we have the attitude towards cults that we do and what kind of role they play in culture. So the first thing to note is, so I think I'm going to actually kind of go backwards rather than going like from prior to the 20th century. So for me, there was, I think the most blatantly cult-like thing I was part of was something that was called Black Lotus. Okay. And it's, I often, honestly, I usually itch a little bit anytime anybody refers to it as a cult, not because it's inaccurate, but because the word cult comes with a lot of extra connotation that I find, and a lot of inclination to dismiss, like, oh, it's just a cult. Okay. There's something about this that I find a kind of almost like disrespectful. I'm so glad I'm not in it anymore. Like I graduated, right? I'm not part of this anymore, and that is great. It doesn't exist anymore. It was thoroughly destroyed by victim consciousness. But and a whole lot of how dare you. But the thing is that there was actually something very important, very powerful that gave me a lot of orientation that I needed at the time. Being part of that, and particularly the main person who was leading this, Brent Dill, is a fantastically powerful character, very, very intense, very immensely smart, and he had an amazing ability to examine somebody's way of being and predict in a lot of detail how they were going to unfold and when, what kinds of personality transformations they were going to go through, and roughly how long it was going to take, and what kinds of attitudes they would end up having. So like his ability to tell this stuff and to guide people through very powerful spiritual experiences, this was immense, real power, real spiritual power. And part of the point that you'll find when you actually dig into anything like meaty about cults is that if you don't immediately dismiss them, which is not the same thing as condoning them, but like recognizing there's something very powerful at the core here. Like, what is the draw? Is the draw people being stupid? People getting hoodwinked? Oh, they're put into kind of a trance. Right. So, right. This is part of the reason why we haven't actually addressed Nazism. So I'll get to that in a bit. But when the issue, the core issue, is that for me, my relationship with, my connection with Brent offered meaning. It offered a pathway for me to sort things out. Like I was on the edge of suicidally depressed when I got folded into Brent's sphere and into Black Lotus. And he cured me of that. And I could like that have noticed in particular the way that the language is structured. He cured me, like I'm a recipient. This is a very common type of thing that'll show up in the reason why cults are the way they are. And there's this basic structure, which I should also note. Brent, like any kind of powerful figure, is incredibly complicated, and there's a lot of nuance. I'm not going to try to explain everything about that situation, but I'm trying to provide a little bit of my own personal experience, a little bit of my own context. That I have personally encountered this stuff. I know what it's made of on the inside and on the outside. I've seen both sides of this. But the important part was that regardless of what Brent was trying to do, the way I received it, the way I took it was, I am a recipient of this wisdom and it's transforming me. And yes, I'm seeing things on my own, but Brent has things to teach me. And Brent has all this power, and that's outside of me. That business of seeking meaning outside is a very common structure, and it's actually very core to the Western meaning-making system as it has existed for millennia. It's not, sorry, that isn't quite what I mean. I mean, it's something more like the way that the ideas survived got this thread. You'll see this, for instance, in Catholicism. There's this idea that you are transformed into a deeper relationship with God and through Christ and all of this power by going to Mass. And when you go to Mass, you are a recipient of the magic of a priest who does transubstantiation. This transubstantiation of turning the wafer into the flesh of Christ and turning the wine into the blood of Christ. That this is not a metaphor. This is actually what's happening. It's magic. And you cannot do this unless you become ordained and are a recipient of the tradition that comes through Christ, through Peter, down through the lineage of the papacy, into the legitimacy of a priest who is able to give you salvation. So this is part of the Catholic context, or at least it used to be. Something changed with Vatican II. I don't. This particular meaning-making thing stopped being nearly as relevant about 500 years ago, especially about 300 years ago with the scientific revolution. So the part of the thing that I want to highlight here is, where is the context of the search? Like, why did somebody like Brent appeal as, or at least it's the way I perceived Brent as offering something? Why did that appeal to me? This is a very common type of thing where people are embedded in a context that feels importantly devoid of meaning. I'm not describing anything here in a lot of detail about meaning. I'm just going to let this be intuitive for the most part. But if you can contrast this with what it would have been like to be a Christian 1,000 years ago in Europe, in Western Europe. If you have some sense of, I don't know what I'm doing with my life, you talk to a priest. And the priest gives you orientation, and the community is unanimous about the worldview of being within Christendom. And we are in the kingdom of God, and we recognize through the blatant magic, they didn't call it magic, but like the miraculous power of the clergy. I mean, like there's a way of relating to what the written word was at that time that we've lost track of. And I may go into this in a lot more detail in a different episode, but there's a way of relating to what writing was 1,000 years ago that we don't understand today anymore. We view what is written as information. You read it and then you understand. But 1,000 years ago, the only people who, wait, that's no good. My tea gets cold. So the only people who could read were those who had devoted their lives to serving the Lord, right, in service to the church. And the act of reading would have been something of like there wouldn't have been a clear distinction between reading and speaking. Like you may remember being a little kid having to learn how to not just sound out the words, but to actually stop moving your mouth as you read. Like that was a skill. It was an actual transformative skill. This is something that our culture has decided is important, and that we've conveyed because it's a matter of, it actually has to do with memetic propagation. It was a memetic evolution. But 1,000 years ago, reading the Bible was not something of you look at the information and then you tell people about it. Those two steps weren't separate. Instead, what would happen is the act of reading the words would be the act of speaking it. And this is the word of God. So God is speaking through you by the miraculous act of you reading his word. Okay? This has magical power. Right? So there's this sense of, I will now read from the Bible. It's not, okay, we're now going to listen to the Bible. It's God is about to speak. God's going to speak in Latin. I don't understand Latin, which is why I need priests to interpret it for me. Right? But like, there we are. Okay. So this, so 1,000 years ago, there would have been this blatant display of magical power that provides context for what people yelling in the background. So this would have provided context so that if you don't know what you're doing with your life, you would have been oriented. You would have known what you're doing. You would have had someone to turn to. You would have had community to turn to that all believes in this worldview. But today we don't have that. There is no coherent worldview. And to the extent that we have anything like a coherent worldview, the worldview is devoid of what is meaningful. How do I grow into a better person? If I want to deepen my relationship with truth and reality, what do I do? The closest thing we have to an answer is something like, well, study more science and then you'll know more facts. And maybe you can understand something about how the world works. Not that that matters, because once you die, you're just dead and you're gone and it doesn't matter. But maybe you can pass something on to other generations so that they can continue to ignore the gnawing nihilistic void of irrelevance as we march inexorably towards the heat death of the universe. But we just won't pay attention to that. Nothing really matters in the long run, but let's ignore that fact and just try to make the economy good. There's this big void, this really deep void in what I've referred to in previous episodes as the scar in the Western soul. It's this sense of a disconnect, a kind of knowing in the heart that there's something more, but it gets interpreted by the mind as wishful thinking. Like, well, and maybe there isn't, maybe this is it. But to loop this back to cults, the way modern Christianity works, and I want to emphasize when I'm saying this, I'm not dismissing modern Christianity. Okay? I'm pointing out something that's common in the groundwater, in the memetic groundwater, between modern Christianity and the appeal of cults. Modern Christianity, especially the Protestant branches, which is most of them that are in the United States, most of the various churches you'll see, and most of the attitudes of being Christian, when you talk about the Bible Belt and the religious right and all of that, you're mostly talking about Protestants. The idea that you can have a direct relationship with God or a direct relationship with Christ, that you're bringing Christ into your heart, and that part of your practice is reading your Bible and knowing your Bible stories. That this is why in Protestant churches you have ministers, you don't have priests, right? Because they administer. They're like moderators. They're like holding a context where everybody can sort of pray together so that there's a feeling of community. But there's a sense of isolation as well, where each person is developing their own personal relationship with God, rather than everybody being a recipient of the power of the Lord through the priest. Right? There's a lot of this independence streak that shows up in the way that America does religion, specifically Christianity. That's because of Protestantism. So the today, when somebody finds meaning in Christ, particularly in the United States, and we're just going to focus on the United States because that's what I know best, there's this isolating quality to it. There's this frankly Calvinist, I talked about this last week, this Calvinist fear of corruption. Like there's all this terror around, is Pottermania corrupting our children by tempting them into witchcraft and the path of the devil? Why is that a problem? Right? Well, the reason it has to be that way, the reason people have this reactive quality to it, is that in order for a meaning-making system to work, it has to insulate itself somehow against the nihilistic munching of the larger culture that says things like, well, I mean, of course God doesn't exist. I mean, you can believe whatever you want, but if you believe in God, you're stupid. You know, because we're obviously in a materialist world where nothing means anything. It's made of atoms, which are made of subatomic particles, which are made of quarks and stuff like that. And we understand this stuff with physics, and here's all this stuff with science, and it's just a bunch of mathematical rules that are all bumping together, and scientists know the real truth, but the real truth is that there's nothing to really hope for. Because what does it mean to be a better person? Better according to what? Like there are no real standards because it's all just meaningless bumping matter. So and so let's, like, I don't know, distract ourselves with like social stuff about, oh, like we have to make sure that like we're not fracking too much, or we need to actually frack so we have like oil independence, or like people get all uppity about this entertainment, because the question of what would victory look like? What would it look like for us to all be unified and say, let's actually create heaven on earth? What does that utopia look like? There's no vision. Anybody who comes up with a vision starts to sound like a cult leader. Okay. So in order for people to really be Christians today in this larger context, they have to basically create a meaning moat. There has to be a way to separate. There are methods of saying, you know, I used to dismiss all of this stuff, but I came to recognize the truth of Christ, and I'm bringing Christ into my heart, and now I feel something. I feel the truth of it, and I want to emphasize there's actually something real about this. The details of the nature of the story and the explicitly Christian elements of it, I suspect that's just a frame. It's a memetic thread. It's a very specific one, but when you understand the context, you can see, you know, specifically calling this Christ, like you're doing something real by naming it that, but it's not because of what the Bible said. It's something else. There's something else going on. I'm not going to try to go into that in too much detail here. I mean, I run a program called Mage that is designed to help people learn how to touch the real thing so that they can see for themselves how this works and how to do the real thing, whatever it is, whether it's a Christian or you want to do this as an alchemist or whatever. Like there's a way to relate to truth directly, pulling a little bit on the appeal of Protestantism, but there's just truth to it. Like what truth is truth. So when you see it, it's there, it's yours, and you know it the same way that mathematicians know that a proof is true once they understand the proof. There's no intermediary necessary. And in fact, having an intermediary blurs something. So there's a whole program I run people through. sort of a dojo to train this stuff, and I'm not going to try to like, do that here. Like, that's too much. But I do want to emphasize that I'm not dismissing the experience. There is something literally divine and important about coming into this kind of relationship that people get from being born again. But there's a move that becomes necessary in there of, I had fallen from grace, and now I am accepting Christ into my heart, and I will never question it again. So what's with that? And I will never question it again. Like the defensiveness. Because if you have a clear relationship to truth, you don't have to defend against it. It's just a fact. Oh, I'm not going to question this again. That's just true. I see the truth of it. Right? I'm not going to question the Pythagorean theorem. Like the square of this hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the square of the other two sides. Okay, like aside from it being a memorized fact, once I actually see the proof and I make the proof part of me, once I understand it, I get it. I see it. It's true. And it's like, okay, great. I don't have to go, and I will never question this again. I will never question again that I am holding this cup. Like what's with the extra juice? What's it for? Well, the reason it's there is because there's a real fear being defended against, which is a kind of corruption or I mean, it's framed as corruption on the inside, but this attempt on the part of the larger kind of zombie culture. There's this larger sense of, you're making meaning, and that's distorting you from the truth, because the truth is that there is no meaning. So if you're feeling meaningful, that means that there's something wrong with you or something twisted about your perspective. There's something you're not paying attention to. And so like why is Richard Dawkins, who incidentally created the term meme, when I talk about memetics, I have him to thank as the father of the term and the ability for us to have a word and a concept to hold this metastructure. Even though he didn't take it all the way, but like that isn't what fathers are for, right? So he has been on this warpath about atheism and about how like supporting atheism and taking down religion, because religion corrupts clear scientific thinking. Why is this so important? Part of it is that he can get a sense of meaning from it in a way that is more compatible with the nihilistic tone of the larger cultural milieu, sort of atmosphere. It is saying, how dare you ignore the scar in the Western soul? That scar is real, you should suffer. Because that suffering is true. But it's not creating a deep, wise orientation to that suffering that allows it to be processed, integrated, digested, and transcended. It's instead just a direct attack on attempts to make meaning. Because attempts to make meaning are divorced from the reality of science, which incidentally is utter bullshit and is dismissive of the origins of science, why science became powerful in the first place, where its insights came from, and what its actual source of power is. But that's for another time. So I promised an arc of the 20th century, and I'm about halfway through the episode here. So let me spell out something here. I keep referring to the scar in the Western soul. I had a previous episode where I really went into it, but I've gestured at it a number of times. The essence of it is this quality of being separated from anything higher. This quality of there is no heaven, there is no other world, there is no spirit realm. And it is incidentally the same thing as this quality of I am separate from what I observe. So I will observe it, and the act of observing it tells me things about it without changing me. That is a manifestation. This observer-observe cut is the same thing as it is not that this is a lesser shadow of the greater world. It is that there is no greater world. This is it. The sense of there being a greater world still shows up in things like, well, the truth of how reality works is appearing in, for instance, these laws of physics, and the laws of physics follow this mathematics. So you have to explore and understand this mathematics in order to really see the structure of physics and to see the structure of the world as it really is. To which a very uncomfortable question is, where are these laws of physics? Where is the math? Where is the Pythagorean theorem, for instance? If this is what is real, and this is all that is real, and we're exploring it, what structures it? The intuition pulls from Platonism, and particularly Neoplatonism, the idea that this is a shadow world projected from the realm of pure ideas. The reason we have ideal, meaning perfect, comes from the Plato's theory of ideas, the ideal realm, and ideal forms being the true thing that casts its shadow into the world and creates. For instance, there is the ideal cup casts its shadow into this cup. This is an instance of it. It's a shadow projection, but it's fake in a very fundamental way. And so part of the move was to say, no, we're just in the realm of shadows. There is no light. There is no beyond. But we still carry these intuitions because we can't get away from them. It is, in fact, false to say that this is all there is. It's just false. But modern mind has and the postmodern mind has a lot of difficulty orienting to that claim. So that had already been set by the time we opened the stage on the 20th century. The Industrial Revolution had already gotten a lot of momentum. Science had already blossomed out. We already went through the Romantic period, where people had tried to say, I think there's something important about this. And since logic and reason and making sense of things keeps pointing us towards this direction of nihilistic meaninglessness, meaning must be in the direction of following the dictates of the heart and ignoring everything having to do with what's reasonable. And this is part of where we have a whole bit of love knows no reason nor no bounds. That there is no logic to falling in love. That falling in love is this beautiful experience that transcends. It is the most powerful force in the world, and that it's not something that you can logically understand. Like all of that. It has much older threads, but it comes from the Romantic movement of the 1800s, the 19th century. So this just sets the stage for the 20th century. And in the 20th century, I could spend a long time talking about the history of the 20th century. Let me highlight the main pieces that matter. So one of the answers given to this meaning crisis, to the gnawing of nihilism, is, well, since like there's this quote. If I had realized I was going to reference Nietzsche, I would have pulled up this quote. But people know that Friedrich Nietzsche, had said God is dead. At least when it was told to me, the impression I got was, oh yeah, he was proclaiming we are at the end of the theistic period of humanity. Here we've killed religion. But if you read the rest of the quote, it says something along the lines of, God is dead and we have killed him. How shall we grapple with the immensity of being the greatest murderers that could ever possibly be and ever have been? He was naming the meaning crisis. He was naming this point of, we have killed our sense of there being anything larger, so now what? We're carrying this moral weight, but there isn't even a context with which to orient to morality. So what does the moral weight even mean? So one suggestion, one kind of answer that Nietzsche gave was will to power. The idea that the main role, this had existed for a while before then, but one of the main roles that God played as a source of meaning is that he, capital H, he had the power to exert his will on the world, that everything followed according to his will. So when you take away God and now it's all dead dust, it's just mechanical stuff moving around. One way to create meaning is to become like God, is to recognize, well, I seem to have a will. So if I can bring my will to actually affect the world, then I am reintroducing meaning. So maybe I can create meaning where there was none before by becoming God-like, personally, but also us collectively. So humanity can become God-like and therefore reintroduce meaning. You may hear and notice in this, there's this quality that that shows up in, for instance, 1950s flavored science fiction. This whole, you'll find this in transhumanist circles, this idea of humanity is bringing in the light of consciousness and brilliance into the world, and we will expand into the stars, and we will create space colonies, and we will transform ourselves and get past the limitations of the flesh, so that we can live as long as we like. We can make ourselves more intelligent and more capable of clear thought, and what we can build and create. Like, this is just with what we can currently imagine. Imagine what we can't even imagine yet, of our capability of expanding out and bringing meaningfulness into this lifeless universe. We can introduce meaning and love and purpose into reality. This is part of the meaning-making engine that I was raised on. So I got like the full injection of like singularitarian, Kurzweilian vision, and the immortalist, transhumanist, cryonicist ideas with nanotechnology and artificial intelligence and all of this stuff, like creating this beautiful future for humanity. And this is what we are growing towards, sort of our destiny. So most people, I think, have not encountered that depth of it, but you get little hints of this in terms of the 1950s saying, scientists have now figured out how to wash your clothes in ways that you can just walk through this pool, and science bringing convenience into everyday living. Soon, you won't even have to walk to work. You can just want to be at work, and then science will provide you with the answers. So this quality of almost like Big Daddy coming in and, right? So I'm going to zoom out and highlight this whole business of like will and power, and all this defined something like a couple of different arcs for strategies for dealing with the nihilistic mawing, the nihilistic destruction of orientation. One strategy was to go out and conquer, to actually just, we have the power. We are power. We are the introduction of divinity to existence. We are the firstborn. This was the core seed that became Nazism. A lot of people get caught up in the details of Nazis are focused on what we would now call white supremacy, on persecuting the Jews and also gypsies and homosexuals, that they were these monsters who are like focusing on the fascism aspects of this is how we're going to organize it. So today, when people say, yeah, Nazis were evil, what they are saying, like they're picking out the form. It's like saying predators are evil, therefore we're going to hate things with fur, that have stripes on the fur. It has a very similar quality to it. So like, Nazism, most people have no idea what Nazism is anymore. Nazism is now more a archetypal symbol. It is something that we grab onto as meaning evil. And so the things that people tend to seem to latch onto when they talk about, oh, that's so Nazi, this is a Nazi thing. What they mean is that it is fascist, which is a social structure style. It's like fascism isn't inherently evil. The problem is that fascism is an outsourcing of power, but I'll hopefully get to that. it's like saying democracy, like then we transcend democracy and then we go back into feudal fiefdom or something like that, and we recognize, oh yeah, like back when democracy and all those Democrats and like, can you imagine us having that kind of language for Nazism, or having the same kind of tone for Democrat or democracy as we do for Nazism? It's hard to imagine, but it's not out of the question for history to do something like that. I'm not advocating Nazism either, of course, because no one's allowed to do that. But also because it's stupid. But the point is that what I'm trying to highlight is that people don't see it anymore. What they see are these aspects, like fascism, the thing about racial supremacy, the kind of might makes right in a group thing, right? Sometimes specific things having to do with if you pull too much on Norse mythology, or you get too much meaning out of Norse religion, like you start drawing with runes and stuff like that, that can start to wig people out. Like if you could get tattoos of runes, this is starting to fade, but the fact is that the Nazis actually were very much into the occult and were pulling very strongly from the Vikings, recognizing the Vikings were an expression of power. So, but that attempt to inflict will on the world collectively in order to create meaning created horror. There's no question about that. People ask questions, blah, blah, but I think it's pretty solid that this is a major, major trauma for the human race. Never again. People went, well, that sucked. Let's never do that again. And that was just one of the major strategies. One of the other major strategies is, okay, well, can we build God in the form of some kind of decentralized collective? This is the strategy that for the most part won out, particularly in, especially in the United States, but this also showed up in throughout the Western world, and therefore in the westernized world, this pattern got copied. This is the whole thing about when people talk about what government should do, or that's not fair when referring to things that the government is doing. What's happened is this was a different approach, which was, well, let's trust institutions. The whole thing about the 1950s, science will create a beautiful future, and just you sit there and wait, and we're going to deliver it to you on a silver platter because you deserve it. Just do your job, be a part of society, and like a good citizen. And it's another orientation, but instead of applying will to power, this is a strategy of distraction. Let yourself be entertained, just do your job, do your part. Don't ruffle your feathers too much. Just be appropriate within the structure and trust Big Daddy to take care of you. And trust that Big Daddy is doing things that make sense and has your best interests at heart. Oh no, look at this, there's some government corruption. Well, that's unfortunate because there are some bad seeds, but the American institution is the greatest government that has ever existed. And you can trust that we mean good here. One of the most potent effects of the pandemic was to destroy that myth. It was already becoming very broken down, and it was already senile. It was aging. It was very geriatric. But the pandemic demonstrated to many people, it wasn't universal, but it was loud enough that this is now a point of conversation, that these institutions are incoherent and not trustworthy. And a lot of how they chose to react to questions of, hey, I think you guys aren't being very trustable, was to exert more power and force. Now, I'm separating this from the question of whether they were right about details of the pandemic and coronavirus and what policies and that needed to be enacted. I'm not making any kinds of accusations along those lines here. I have opinions, but the opinions don't matter on that level nearly as much as seeing the memetic flow. Recognizing that there was this basic strategy that the West dove into, particularly in the wake of Nazism. I mean, it had already been there, but this is like doubling down. All right, this is how we're going to do it. Like we're we're orienting this way, which is why the 1950s happened after World War II. Right, this attitude was kind of there beforehand, like in the Roaring Twenties. You had a bunch of this stuff, but this business of, oh, don't you worry your pretty little head. Right? It's not your job to understand these things. Like that, scientists will take care of it for you, and your representatives will listen to your concerns and will take care of you. Like that whole attitude arose in part in response to, it was in part response to Nazism. It was also a response to communism. Communism was another, let's outsource everything to government. It was just taking this strategy of trust big daddy to the extreme in a particular way. I'm not going to go into communism right now, but the part of the issue, like having with all of this, you may notice a thread here, because this recurring thread of meaning has to happen outside of me. It has to happen out here. So the first pushback against this institutional thing, this whole outsourcing to institutions, the first major pushback, at least that I'm aware of, was the free love revolution, the hippie revolution. Which, calling it a revolution is kind of funny. Its two loudest effects were to introduce Eastern mysticism and yoga to the West and say, this stuff is cool. Let's popularize this, and to get psychedelics made illegal, to start the war on drugs. Like those are like some of the major impacts that we still feel today from that. But today, when people talk about spirituality, especially when they start saying things like, I'm spiritual but not religious, what they're talking about is this pushback against institutions. Like, what it means to be religious is that you are trusting an institution to guide you into what your relationship is with the divine. Even Protestantism had this business of, you come to a personal relationship with the Lord, but you do it through the Bible, and it's Jesus. If you start talking about praying to Odin, you have completely missed the point, and you're a heretic. Because we're still Christians. Christianity is obviously the right thing to do. Why? Because, right? But the hippie revolution introduced more forms of spirituality. It's not like cults didn't exist before this, but the cults really started taking off with the challenge to, I don't think the institutions are actually working in our favor, and they're missing out on things that are really important, and they're not delivering on the hope of a meaningful life. Right? I feel squeezed down in terms of who I am allowed to be. So, and more importantly, there's still this heart intuition of, there's something wrong with the overall narrative that the West is holding. This scar, this split from heaven, this sense that heaven isn't real. So how do I come to orient to that? Which is part of why there was all of this grabbing towards things like Zen and yoga and Buddhism. It was providing fresh memetic blood, giving some more context. So, but the thing is that, again, in the way that I was describing for modern Christianity, in order for a meaning-making system that is opposed to the larger culture's attitudes towards what kind of meaning-making system is allowed, in order for these meaning-making systems to work, they have to have something like memetic modes. They have to have a way of defending themselves against the context, so the context doesn't eat them. So you end up with things like these claims of, and these claims have some weight behind them, the sense of, if you listen to people who are challenging the doctrines that we are working with, then you may get dissuaded from the clarity that we are creating in our community here, and you will be lost. So it's really important for you to make your social and emotional connections predominantly within this sphere, so that it is possible for you to be able to orient to your own spiritual growth without getting destroyed by the larger context that says that there's no such thing as spiritual growth. or that is telling active lies or confusions about spiritual growth. Now, the fact is that there is truth to that. That doesn't mean I advocate it. But the reason that pattern happens with cults is not just because, oh, this is a memetic mutation that can screw with people's minds. It's that in order to be able to do something that is meaningfully spiritually different from the larger culture, you need to have a way of doing something different from the larger culture. And there aren't a lot of known strategies for doing that. Social emotional isolation is one of them. Okay. And it also turns out that if you do that, some of the bits of practical lived embodied wisdom that exist in the culture for things like how to not physically die, how to not traumatize yourself with basic things having to do with sex or with family or with like I'm trying to like see a good example would be okay, so getting drunk. Okay, so alcohol is the most psychoactive substance that we have a lot of cultural institutions that are widespread and known for how to orient to. It's almost never used as a transformative experience. I've sometimes toyed with how would you do the equivalent of a plant medicine ceremony with alcohol. It's very tricky, and I think it's actually an advanced spiritual move, because one of the main effects of alcohol is to disconnect your capacity to integrate. So you have to be incredibly skilled at what shamans might describe as the process of transferring power from the spirit world back into your physical body. You can reframe this in non-spirit world shamanistic terms. But there's a thing of like when people get drunk and they just love everybody. And man, like I'm just way too uptight. I should really relax more. The resources for taking that insight and bringing it into your sober state. Alcohol interferes with that process, and the surrounding culture doesn't build bridges for that very well. So it's very, very difficult to do actually powerful, transformative ceremonies with alcohol. But we do know how to make it so that if somebody gets a hold of a bunch of alcohol and they decide to experience it, we know how to work with them. We know how to take them to a hospital if they're poisoned with taking literally too much. If they're stumbling around drunk, we recognize it and we know how to handle it so that they don't harm themselves or other people too much. The thing about driving is complicated, but we have social infrastructure to keep people disinclined to drive while drunk, and that if they start moving in that direction, the community will often come in and stop them. So we have a social infrastructure for dealing with alcohol. We don't have that for ayahuasca, for instance, just to grab an example. I could just as well have grabbed LSD or psilocybin mushrooms or any of these as examples. But the thing is that because there is no culture for these, sorry, what I mean is there's no widespread culture for this. It's not in the mainstream. In order for you to go through something transformative, you need to be in a context that has a kind of isolation. And generally, the communities like that, unless you go to something traditional, like you actually work with Shipibo shamans in Peru, which has become a tourist thing, so it's getting kind of diluted. But if you aren't embedded in a culture that has a long history of working with these and has their equivalent of this is how you deal with drunk people, this is how you deal with ayahuasca people. If you don't have that cultural knowledge, that deep ancient cultural knowledge, and instead you have a bunch of people who say, hey, let's pop some LSD and see the universe. Wow, that was really transformative. And LSD has only been around since the 60s, 50s or 60s, something like that. So there can't be centuries of cultural knowledge of how to deal with LSD states. It's just too young. So this means that when you have this cult isolation effect where you're trying to do this spiritual transformative thing and you're challenging cultural wisdom, I mean, all the cultural infrastructure for how do you deal with it when you're overwhelmed and confused, and now you're taking in a substance. Like I'm describing literal substances for like drug-based cults, but anything psychoactive, which can be ideas, it can be ceremonies, having sex with people in ritualistic ways, or the guru saying you need to go through erotic transformation, you need to get you past your sexual blocks. There's like you can see where you could get a lot of sex scandals from this, even if the guru means well, and even if it's clear within this context. All of the social support structures that in fact do have wisdom in the larger culture can't enter because of the memetic mode. So you can end up traumatizing people in ways that the larger culture could have prevented. Right? See Tin mentioning that mechanism of cult isolation and its reasons for existing seem really clear now that you mention it. Yeah. So this is part of what I mean when I'm referencing how calling something a cult as a dismissal seems like it's doing a disservice, even though it's naming something real, which is that the creation of an isolated pocket, an isolated memetic pocket, is a risk. Because the whole act of isolating, the whole act of insulating is in fact doing something to cut you off from whatever actual wisdom exists in the ambient culture. And that may be keeping you safe in ways that you have no idea about, that no one has any idea about, and you don't know until you have crossed some line that your ancestors 1,000 years ago already figured out organically and have folded into assumptions about how you interact with people. But it's not explicit knowledge, it's embedded implicit knowledge, embodied knowledge, and cultured knowledge. It's just how you do things. The problem is that all of those, it's like the roots of wisdom are entangled with the roots of weeds. And so when you try to weed, you pull out the wisdom. You try to, so like, how do you deal with the nihilistic scar in a way that doesn't destroy the aspects of wisdom that are actually in the mainstream? We don't have an answer to that question. I think I see the beginnings of an answer to that question, but it is the beginnings. And it is not something that I personally can just say, here is the answer. This is what you all need to do. I mean, I could, but the only reason that would be relevant is if you can come to see it for yourself in a way that is independent of me, and that doesn't require you to isolate yourself from the larger culture in order to see. Right? So it's a deep puzzle. It's something that we collectively are working on figuring out. When people talk about the evolution in human consciousness and how we seem to be on some kind of precipice of some sort of huge transformation, this is part of what's involved. How do we reorient to being in a larger spiritual context without losing our minds? No one knows the answer to that, but it's incredibly clear we really need an answer. Really, really need one. Okay. So, it seems worth highlighting a couple of details that have emerged over the last 60-ish years, something like that, 50 or 60 years. The Jonestown Massacre was a really powerful, very acute, traumatic instance that still lives in the collective. This is one of the reasons why there's a collective allergy against things being cults. It's not just the Jonestown Massacre, but that really synthesized it. And that's where the Kool-Aid thing comes from, where all these people died from drinking cyanide-laced Kool-Aid. There was an impact, like if you sort of zoom out, Nazism said, let's get meaning by creating impact on the world. Let's have a way of orienting to meaning making that creates a large culture that we can do something with, that we can act, we can be strong, we can be proud of our history, we can be proud of our existence, and we can have a future that we can construct. Let's build this with energy, with life, with vividness, and with righteousness and power. And it turns out that created one of the most horrifying instances of all of human history, the Holocaust. That was a huge trauma. So the whole world recoiled and went, okay, let's be really careful about anything that sounds anything like that. Which is they started focusing on things like white supremacy and the symbol of the swastika and the Nazi salute. Like, it's apparently still illegal in Germany to do the Nazi salute. And people get embarrassed if you do that. It's just like, I promise the Nazi salute did not cause the Holocaust. But but importantly, neither did white supremacy. And this is something that a lot of people miss. Neo-Nazism mostly is not neo-Nazism. It's not real neo-Nazism. It's neo-Nazi symbolism. It's neo-Nazi symbolism. Real, like the closest thing that we actually have to I say Marcel is like a German saying, yes, it is. And I see you mean, yes, it is still illegal to do the Nazi salute in Germany. Yeah. So sort of like a little awkward for me to be demonstrating it on video, whereas people might be seeing the screen, et cetera. And like, oh well. So the closest thing that we have to, yeah, and many slogans and symbols around it. Yeah, and because they're focused on the form, they're not focused on the essence. The actual closest example that we have today to real neo-Nazism is critical race theory. How's that for ironic? The attempt to destroy white supremacy and all this elements of Nazism is itself borrowing from the memetic threads of Nazism, but actually created its essence. But this is a very difficult and slippery thing to name clearly and specifically and to dissect in detail, because we're so used to equating Nazi with evil, rather than recognizing that the Nazis were doing something in response to a context, and that there's a particular flavor to their attempted solution. And the idea of the solution was not, let's create as much horror as possible. That was an accidental downstream effect. I say accidental in the sense that it wasn't planned from the beginning. It was a derived, I should say, it's a derived effect of this memetic thread. I don't think critical race theory, the whole anti-racism thing, has the social positioning or the coherence to be able to replicate Nazism. I don't think it would happen. But you can imagine where, what if it were decided that the actual problem with the world is that internalized racism keeps getting supported through the fact that white men benefit from their privilege and they are too unconscious of what they are doing. So what we need to do is round up all of the white men and isolate them from society so that we can clean up culture. It's worth bearing in mind that part of the reason the Nazis were targeting the Jews was, at first there was this concern about them corrupting the noble culture of the Aryan race. And then there was a claim that the Jews were actually more diseased, that they were carrying disease and it was necessary to isolate them. Okay, that was the core seed of this. So you can see where there's like, if anti-racism could somehow become a central movement, like a political party in a country with a military, how we might actually replicate many of the same behaviors of the Nazis. It just won't happen because it's not socially positioned that way. But there's, there's something ironic about the fact that anti-racism nominally condemns Nazism, but it does so in a way that re-embodies the reason why it created horror to begin with. So Tim mentioning, it would be nice if we could learn from history without demonizing sides. Yeah. That's the whole game. That's the whole thing. If you can actually orient to the context of the whole world and the whole of time, the whole thing that brings you to where you are, and you can see it clearly, you can recognize that demonizing is itself part of the distortion, which isn't to say demonizing is bad, but just a fact that demonizing hides things, and that the mechanism of hiding itself creates problems. That you can learn to see that and see how it happened throughout history. And the more clearly you see that, the more clearly you can recognize that whatever kind of solutions there are to creating a beautiful future for humanity, it's not going to look like finding the bad guys and destroying or isolating them, or noticing the bad ideas and never thinking or speaking them again. Can't be. Just guaranteed won't be that way. But humanity is still very young and is still trying to figure that lesson out. So one step at a time. So there's one last piece I want to highlight here in terms of cults and how the cult mechanism works. One sorry effect from, first you go through the Nazis going, oh shoot, big like national scale, like pride in your nation is maybe dangerous. Which is part of why there was there's been this slow decay of national sentiment, that plus communist propaganda. But then the Jonestown Massacre and sex scandals from various gurus and so on, and instances with Scientology, although Scientology didn't have as strong a memetic impact as the Jonestown Massacre did. In part because Scientology is obsessed with memetics implicitly. They have a particular immune system to it that's interesting. It's fascinating. It's something that might be worth a case study at some point. But one effect of this has been that people keep getting exposed to these horrors over and over again. I say people, like our cultures have been exposed over and over again to the horrors of trying to create pockets of meaning in a meaningless context of the mainstream thought egregore structures, the super memeplex of the westernized world. So this is generalized to an allergy to meaningful frameworks. Okay. So there's now this, it's sort of like literally cultivating an allergy. It's a memetic allergy. There's an inflammation response that is a memetic immune system that's going, that idea is too similar to something that almost killed me 50 years ago. So like it's a little bit like people who have deadly bee sting allergies often don't die from their first bee sting allergy. What happens is the first bee sting allergy creates an immune system response such that the next time they get stung by a bee, their whole system flips its shit, and then they get all this swelling because the swelling is trying to deal with the bee venom, but it's overreacting. There's something like that that happens now with meaning-making systems. If something feels too meaningful and makes too much sense, that's reason for it to raise suspicion. And thanks to things like the Jonestown Massacre, we have a name for systems of making meaning that make too much sense, which is cult. Now, we've, in large part, thanks to a kind of psyop that's happened around conspiracy theories, we also have, oh, that's a conspiracy theory as a way of dismissing an idea cluster. But here's a question for you. Was QAnon a cult? A lot of people would say yes, obviously. But it's curious because QAnon didn't encourage people to do things like socially isolate themselves so that they could go through some deep spiritual transformation. It was actually just saying, hey, ask some questions. Let's have these communities where we're trying to figure out what's going on with this anonymous figure who calls himself Q, who's dropping things from supposedly inside of the White House innards, and we're trying to sort out what these codes mean, and here's some interpretations, and just take a look at this stuff. It's a lot more like what is it called, where somebody puts a bunch of Easter eggs inside of a game and people are digging into the code and into the little nuances, and they find out this means they're supposed to like go to some particular geographic location. They dig in the ground. Like there's a whole ARG, I think they're called ARGs. Like ARGs are like fun little games, but everybody knows they're basically fiction and they're constructed there by a person. QAnon is something like an ARG that people don't know is a game. And it would be awfully weird to call an ARG a cult. So the thing that makes QAnon a cult, or made it a cult, it's kind of petered out for the most part, from best as I can tell, or at least it doesn't have much volume. It doesn't get any voice on the mainstream. So if it still exists, I'm unaware of it at this point. But the reason it's a cult is because it gave people a sense of meaning. but it didn't answer any deep spiritual questions. It wasn't telling people how to come into wisdom. It wasn't giving them a way of relating to the deeper reality that is beyond the physical world. It wasn't telling them how to relate to death, or if they don't know what to do with their lives and they're disoriented, how to cultivate virtue. Like, none of that was present in QAnon. All that was present was this sense of, you are part of an arc of history that is going to do something exciting. And if you pay attention to this, it can feel very thrilling. And all you have to do to participate is educate yourself. Something similar happened with the people who were that I was deeply involved with for a long time, the rationality community, particularly in the Bay Area, really concerned about human extinction from artificial intelligence. Is it a cult? Sometimes they'll jokingly chant, "We are not a cult," because being like very ironic about it. But it's weird to even ask that question, because it starts out as an online community where people just chat about this stuff, and there's a whole lot of trying to inform people. Oh, but that's like trying to enroll people in the cult. That's not what's going on, right? Because it's not about social isolation. There's no story about you have to isolate yourself from other people who are not concerned about AI risk, because if you expose yourself to them too much, then you might not be able to go through the transformations necessary to meaningfully be able to stop AI. Like, there's some hints of this. They talk about loss of epistemic integrity, which is to say that they care an awful lot about clarity of thought, and they're worried about certain idea clusters rotting their brains, basically. I think many of them would be horribly aghast to discover, and we probably know at this point, about me as one of the co-founders of the Center for Applied Rationality, thinks there might be something interesting about astrology. Oh man, his mind is gone. Like, oh, okay, I see. So your strategy for memetic integrity consists of defining which memes are toxic and then creating a moat. So there's an element that's similar there. But it's actually the same strategy that's in the mainstream. The idea that if you believe that you are a witch that can cast magic, then you have no business being a scientist. It's part of the mainstream idea cluster. But the reason why there's any inclination to call this stuff a cult in the first place is because it offers something, it fills the place. Tin is mentioning this man fell in the same trap as Carl Jung about astrology. Yeah, never mind that Carl Jung, like, he had an immensely powerful transformative effect on the collective psyche. He was a real mage. He was a powerful person in that he reintroduced the idea of the spirit world in a way that now makes it possible to talk about the spirit world within the mainstream. It's still poo-pooed, but not entirely. Like, this business of, oh yeah, you have a subconscious mind, and this subconscious mind has, there's symbols that you kind of get used to and recognize, that like water being associated with rejuvenation and life. And that's just because the water is a basic element for life and blah, blah, blah. But people can have these associations, and sure, can show up in dreams. If dreams don't mean anything, but yeah, you can put these elements in stories and people recognize the stories. It's like you can hear the dismissive quality, but he managed to sneak it in there. And he managed to sneak it in there so that now we talk about the collective unconscious. That's the new term for the spirit world. So he had quite a powerful effect. In any case, by the way, for those of you whose materialist allergy is flipping out and you're still listening and you're going, man, this guy makes a bunch of sense in some ways, but he just does all this stuff about the spirit world, and like, this just sounds so woo. Like, that's the materialist allergy. It's a memetic allergy. And to offer you a mild and globulin shot, there's a whole conversation to have about this, to really dig into it and to really rectify and clarify this. But I could have said all of this in the framework of materialism. When I talk about the spirit world, I'm not talking about there being some ghostly other realm. That's the materialist vision of the stupid thing. I'm talking about something more like, for instance, how our brains are obviously what is responsible for constructing a 3D reality experience and our experience of time. The laws of physics are interpreted through that framework, but that the actual thing that our laws of physics are based on are not 3D reality and flow of time, but rather that those are the interpretations that our brains provide in order to give us a framework. There's kind of a self-reference loop where our way of making sense of physics and science is based on a framework that that the framework itself is, it describes itself. Like it's hard to say this clearly, but you run into real problems when you try to define, well, what exactly is a brain really, if it's not described in, if the brain is the brain's way of talking about itself, and it's imposing this 3D frame, and it's within the flow of time and evolution and physics and all of that. And that's just how a brain interprets the real thing. What is a brain then, actually? And what is the real thing? Okay. This is something you can go into weird philosophy about, but this starts to hint at things like, where do the laws of physics come from? They can't come from inside the 3D framework. That doesn't make any sense. There is a larger context. There must be a larger context. In fact, there is, in a very important sense, no real debate about there being a larger context. I'm just pointing out that the larger context is something that our default way of thinking, particularly in the westernized world, dismisses the existence of implicitly. And that when you stop doing that, there is obviously something larger you are currently interacting with that you have no idea what it is. And that if you do things that disrupt the way that your brain interprets things in ways that are about 3D and are about the flow of time, so that you interpret things differently, you just do a thing, you do some kind of breathwork thing, or you do a meditation, or you take a psychedelic or something like this, you can sometimes get a reframe that lets you see things that are outside of the frame that you've sort of converged on. And you can encounter things that are different from what you have expected. I am calling the larger world within which the 3D world is embedded the spirit world. Okay, so we don't have to get all super weird and mystical and floaty and like, oh yes, the spirits told me. And this is just a way of talking about it. Okay, so for those of you who have gotten this far and are struggling with your memetic immune system that calls things woo, I hope that helps. Okay. So kind of a punchline that I want to leave you with, to have you to notice, so you leave this episode we've been playing with here. When notice the way that in the larger culture, and also you in particular, if you're part of the larger culture, so the way that this arises in your own body, where you observe a sort of like, I don't know, I trust that, that's weird. Notice that reaction anytime something shows up as meaningful in a way that has a kind of story, a coherence to it, particularly if it starts to offer coherence across time in larger contexts. When are you inclined to worry whether something is a cult? When is the culture inclined to worry whether something is a cult? You'll notice a theme, I think, where calling something a cult means it is dangerously meaningful in a social context, where the sense of danger is not well defined. There isn't a very clear sense of what exactly is the problem. Oh, are the rationalists a cult? What exactly is the problem? The problem being something like, what if you are convinced of something that's false? And then you dedicate your life to orienting to something that is false and destroy things that you might otherwise care about, that you would prefer not to have destroyed, or that you waste a bunch of your time, or you waste your life pursuing something that isn't real. Like maybe this thing about AI risk is a bunch of nerds freaking out about how important nerds are. Right? So that's just a practical question about what is true and what is real. And if you were grounded in truth and orienting to reality in a very stable way, and then you're asking, how can I feel into reality more deeply? There's no problem. There's no problem with listening to these people. They aren't telling you you can't, like, you have to marry another rationalist in order to really be on the true path. I'm not saying things like that. There's no guru. The closest they have to a guru is Eliezer Yudkowsky, but it's popular to point out why Eliezer is wrong about things. I think it's a community of contrarians. No, we're not. Yeah, thank you. Right. So, and I'm just doing this as one example. You could do the same thing with QAnon. QAnon is not talking about the importance of the purity of our genetic heritage to deal with the shape-shifting lizard aliens who are taking over the world and are sacrificing babies, and therefore you have to make sure that like only other QAnoners are the safe ones to breed with. They're not saying things like that, as far as I know. If they are, it's only occasional weirdos within the movement. That's not central to what they're doing at all. The danger of getting exposed to QAnon is something like it might start making sense in particular ways, and it might warp your vision of reality. That's it. It's like reading a really convincing book. So just start to notice this stuff. Notice, what exactly is the allergy? Can you see the allergy at all? Can you notice the allergic response? Secretly, the thing about woo is actually an example of the thing. Yeah. Although that one comes from older, it's more like a turn of the 20th century ballpark, that era. Same origin as terms like quack and pseudoscience. I'll do a separate episode on all of that because it's worth beheading that particular beast at some point. And if you can just start to notice these allergic reactions, I think you'll start to find that there's a place that you can put your feet, where if you're not trying to, like the basic problem with any of these is, and this is the problem the West has been struggling with, in fact, the world has been struggling with, because it's all westernized at this point. And the core issue that we keep running into is the attempt to find meaning outside ourselves. Our attempt to relate to our transformative process of connecting to something larger by finding the larger thing outside of ourselves and a pathway to it outside of ourselves and having that inform us. And then we follow that path. That's the basic problem. As long as we are outsourcing that thing, we're going to keep running into this pain. So if you can notice that, you can start to wake up a little bit, and the world becomes a little clearer. And also cults become a lot less scary. They don't matter so much because they're just interesting perspectives, like a book. So thank you for joining me. I hope this has been fun. If you're watching the replay, if you're watching the replay, feel free to drop a comment in, letting me know how this is landing for you. Or if you're watching this right now, let me know what you're taking away from this. But I come in and check for now and again. If you're watching this on Facebook, many months down the road, like today is June 14th. So if it is like in August or later, and you drop in a comment, I might not see it unless you tag me. I don't know why Facebook just stopped letting me know when people make comments on my videos. But I tend to look for a little while afterwards. So if you drop in a comment, you ask some questions or bring in things, I'll see it and I'll probably interact with you there. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. And yeah, I'll see you all next week. Take care.